Okay, welcome Dr. Mike Ziegler of Monarch Family Chiropractic. And tonight's workshop I find is really valuable in understanding, well, number one, how your brain develops. Number two, if you have any kiddos, why you might consider bringing them into the chiropractor, but also understanding your role in helping support a well-regulated, emotionally sound, I don't like sound, but stable, responsive kiddo in today's world. Really, it doesn't matter if it's today or 20 years ago. How the brain develops is, make sure everyone's muted here. Good. How the brain has developed hasn't changed, but the stress that we experience in the world has. And so we see that impacting how the brain moves through development. So let's go through some stats here and understanding brain development first. There we go. Okay. Our brains at birth. So humans evolved to walk on 2 legs rather than 4. And so the size of the pelvis needed to shrink considerably. So for women, childbirth became more challenging, and we evolved to give birth to babies at a much earlier stage of development, so that a newborn's head could safely pass through a narrower birth canal. Okay. So when we were born, compared to other mammals, humans are considered to have been born halfway through gestation. Okay. So when babies are born at birth, their brains are 25% of the adult size, right? If you look at, just to put it into perspective, right? If a dog gives birth to a litter of puppies, how quickly do you expect and anticipate those puppies walking? Pretty quickly, right? In fact, if they aren't walking pretty quickly, then we know there's something wrong. If you see a cow or a calf born, you see that mama really working hard to get that calf on all 4s immediately when they are born. So what is the difference between humans and every other mammal is that it takes us a good year to get on 2 feet, right? And what we see is that it is the brain moving through development to get this prefrontal cortex, this executive function, this outer portion of the brain online. Okay. So in the first 3 years of life, babies' brains triple in size, reaching 80% of their eventual adult size. And you'll hear me say this, the first 3 years of life is critical. It is the critical window. So we want to make sure we set our baby and our child up to succeed and provide everything we can to support healthy brain development in those first 3 years, right? So between conception until 3 years, our brain circuits for mood, depression, anxiety, addiction, and resilience are built, and they last for life. Okay. The brain does remain plastic. So if you've ever heard of neuroplasticity, that is the architecture of the brain can shift and change based on our experience, but it takes a lot of work. It takes great effort, because what happens within the first 3 years of life and really in childhood really cement in this architecture that is challenging to change later on in life. So let's talk about a little bit more about the brain here. So the brain is made up of cells called neurons and glial cells. Neurons are the conducting cells of the nervous system. They send and receive information, and then glial cells are the support of the neurons. They protect and nourish the neurons. And we are born with nearly all of our brain cells. However, they are not well connected. So if you think about a house as the brain, and you think about all the electrical work, okay? If you got all the electrical there, but it's not connected with any wiring, that is our brain. So in total, our brain has 172 billion cells. And this blows my mind. The infant brain makes 1 million connections per second, and that's guided almost equally by both genetics and experience. So the past time of DNA is our reality. Our genes are our reality is really not what we're finding as far as the epigenetics of the category of epigenetics, which is how genetic expression and our experience. And if nobody else sees these slides, please let me know. Haley, can anyone else see these slides online before I continue? You can give me a thumbs up or, okay, so Berto can see them. Okay. Okay. So Haley, let me know. I think everyone else can see the slides. So let me know. I don't know if there's anything I can do on my end. Unless they're moving, if you're going through them, they can't. I just see the first one. Oh, well, yeah, that's a problem. You should be seeing different slides here. Let's try this. What's going on here? Okay, can you see this different slide? Somebody. That worked. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So just to go back here. This was the slide that you missed is basically everything I was sharing verbally. So let's go back to this. So there is a category of science called epigenetics, and that basically is how your experience, how your thoughts create your reality and turn genes on and off. And so what we're finding is that as this architecture is created in the brain, it's not only based on your genes and your DNA, but it's also based on your experience. So I love this slide. The farthest to the left is a newborn's brain. And so you can see the neurons and the glial cells, but there's not many connections between them. And so newborn stage, during pregnancy and infancy, the brain has approximately 86 billion neurons, 85 billion glial cells, but very few connections. You can see within that 1 month and then 9 month and then 2 year time frame how you start to see many more connections being made based on that kiddo's experience. So during infancy, the brain makes more than 1 million new neural connections per second. And during babyhood and childhood, those connections made between neurons that are saved and covered in protective cells. Connections that are used most often become the strongest and most efficient connections. And it becomes hard to make new connections once protective cells are formed. Okay, so going back to that critical window, based on our experience, we create this architecture, and the more we use that wiring, okay, the more it becomes cemented and then protected by our brain. And so if we want to create a new habit or we want to work through past trauma, it takes great effort to change that because of how our brain really protects this. Okay, we'll get into it in a little bit more. But this adult brain is actually, your brain will prune the circuits or the architecture that is unused. Okay, so an example of this is, let's say you've got a trail through the forest, right? And you've got these points that keep you on that trail. Those neurons are those points that keep you on the trail, that pathway that you cover day in and day out, and it gets really deep into the ground. Those are like those connectors or those synapses between neurons. And if you continue using that trail stays really, it stays. If you stop using that trail, the leaves cover it up nature works its course, and you may be able to find it later on, but it takes a lot more work. There was a thought I had there, but we'll get back to it. So what does the brain need in terms of healthy development? Okay. Our brain needs responsive, nurturing, and attuned caregivers. Okay. A healthy attachment is crucial to promote an emotional and optimal development. With repeated experiences, it causes a collection of brain cells to activate, forming this circuit that will then be saved in the brain and protected in the brain. And so if our interactions, whether they're positive or negative, affect the way our baby's brains grow. And the first 3 years have the greatest impact on brain development. Okay. And so there's something called neuroception. Neuroception is basically where the brain will fill in the gaps on what it perceives and how it processes our environment through past experience. So what that means is, if we go back to, do we have healthy co-regulated relationships? Do we have caregivers that are responsive? If a caregiver is reliably responsive, neural pathways for trust in that caregiver are strengthened with repetition. The child starts to believe that he or she can rely on others and that the world is a safe place. Okay. If the caregiver is unreliably responsive, our neural connections for trust are much weaker. And the child begins to believe he or she can't rely on others, and the world is, in fact, a threatening place. Okay. So most of the time, the mom falls into this category of a responsive caregiver. And we have to, in terms of this presentation, we're going to assume that that child does have that healthy attachment and that healthy, responsive, and support and attuned caregiver to help move this child through healthy development. Because I want to get to, how structure and how the environment and how our spine can impact how we feed the brain and how the brain processes things. But let's go back to this neuroception. So if we aren't given the appropriate responsiveness, if we don't believe that our environment is safe, then our brain will literally create and fill in the gaps for a neurological response to respond to threat. So when you start to hear people who are doing a lot of trauma work, I think trauma is a trendy word. I mean, it's kind of something talked about on multiple levels across healthcare. We have a lot of adults who are doing trauma work, and it takes great effort to move beyond trauma experienced as a child. Because, again, as we just understood, our brain will protect this circuitry and these neural pathways created based off this critical window. And if your brain is tuned into filling the gaps for threat, then you walk into an environment and it is automatically on high alert and it is picking up where it is threatening. And what that means is you are moving into a sympathetic state in a very unsafe way, and cortisol is pumping into your blood, and you are anxious, and you are, just ready to respond as if you need to protect yourself from something life-threatening. Versus if you grow up in a very safe environment, very responsive caregivers, you walk into an environment that could be threatening. It could be, but your brain doesn't even fill in the gaps for that, because it is those pathways that protect it to create safety are overriding, sometimes how we process things. Does that make sense? So when we go back here, between conception and 3 years old, brain circuits for mood, depression, anxiety, and addiction and resilience are built and last for life. The first 3 years are critical to create a healthy architecture and a brain that can really help you many, many years down the road. Okay. So that's why trauma work is so, it takes so much effort and takes so much work, and you feel like you take one step forward and 2 steps back, but well worth it. So what else does the brain need in terms of healthy development? And I want to look at it through the lens of chiropractic. And I want you to think about, how does the brain process the world, right? We've got to assume that you've got healthy attachments and healthy caregivers to support you moving through development. In chiropractic, we want to look at, well, what is the sensory input that feeds the brain to help that brain move through development? And I really want you to think about the nutrition to the brain is what we see, our visual input, and then how we move, okay? And I want you to think about that brain as developing like a flower. It develops from the inside out, okay? So when we are born, we're born with that very primitive brain. We're right in the brainstem here. Can you guys see my mouse here? We're right in the brainstem. This is the most reptilian, it is the most primitive brain function. Meaning, when a newborn is born, their most sophisticated tool to find food is when you brush along their cheek. It's called the rooting reflex. They'll turn to try and find mama's breast. That is the most sophisticated tool they have to find food. Now, would you agree that, as we move through development, a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 20-year-old have more sophisticated tools to find food? Yes, right? But we've got to get to that developmental stage. So I want you to look at this lower left corner here, this IMR. Our most primitive form of brain function is when we are born. It's called infantile motor reflex or primitive reflexes. And we have these reflexes that are inherent, inborn within our body to help us move through development. Meaning, if I go to a newborn and I run my finger across their cheek, they're going to turn. Okay, if anyone's ever seen the startle reflex, a kid will just, like, you kind of drop them, they're like, ah, right? That's a reflex. If I brush my finger along their toe, their bottom of their foot, their toe should splay up. Okay, so we have these primitive reflexes inborn within us, within this primitive portion of our brain that has our most sophisticated tools. Those should be totally integrated at 1 year old. Okay, and if we don't have healthy movement, and if we don't have good visual input, then it creates gaps in how our brain moves through that development. Okay, so in chiropractic, we call it subluxation. If our spine is not moving appropriately, that changes how the brain is fed information. If a kiddo has a head tilt, and this is how it's receiving their information as they move through development, it can be massively, it can massively change how that brain is able to move fully through that, that brain development. So the next system that comes on board is our movement touch. Okay, that gross motor function, right? Will we all agree that our newborn isn't, as they move through development, they're not going to be walking before they hold their head up, right? They're going to probably hold their head up, and they're going to start lifting their chest, and they're going to start arm crawling, standing, and walking. There is, a trajectory for that. We call it milestones, right? So first we anticipate gross motor function coming on board, and then fine motor function, right? If the kiddo's not walking, we're not going to expect them to hold a pencil and write, have fine motor skills with using a pencil or using utensils to eat, right? So we expect that trajectory of movement to take place. And as their gross motor function comes on board, then we expect more fine motor function to come on board, right? Here's the thing. If we have gaps in how we're moving through development, if we don't have appropriate information feeding the brain, then our brain literally cannot move into movement touch in a healthy way. I don't want to say that. It can't move into movement touch with a good foundation. Okay, that's what I mean. So we've got to look at when, and here's the best way to really gauge that, is you add stress to a kiddo. That's where you're going to start seeing if they have gaps in how their brain has moved through development. Because if they haven't totally integrated their primitive reflexes, and now we're wanting to see healthy movement touch, healthy gross motor function, fine motor function, and now you get up into auditory visual, and we're saying we're demanding kids to follow a structure, sit in a chair, do their homework, right? But they don't have the skill set to handle that higher function, then it's going to be challenging. So let me just finish going through this. I think I'm jumping here. So after movement touch, that's where you see auditory visual. Okay. Meaning receptive language comes on board. Receptive language is the ability to hear and understand what's being said to you. And then the next is expressive language, meaning that kiddo can start expressing themselves. You can start talking. When they are expressing themselves, that indicates that there's comprehension and understanding and learning. Okay. And the highest form of brain function is where we're using more of this executive function, this prefrontal cortex, is visualization and cognition. This means a kiddo has ability to expect what they can visualize what is going to happen in the future based on past events. Okay. They have an ability to create imagery within their mind's eye. They can see, they have memory, recall, they have spatial awareness, they can pick up on nonverbal cues. Okay. So let's move back down. Infantile motor reflex. So a kiddo, typically this is integrated by the first year of life. Okay, movement touch. I find a lot of kiddos tend to be in this, tend to move into the movement touch as a way to help process their world. Meaning, let's say we have a 6-year-old who still has some primitive reflexes showing up. Okay, they skipped some of their milestones. They went basically from sitting to walking. They didn't do a ton of crawling. And now they're 6 years old. They're kind of uncoordinated because they didn't spend a lot of time integrating those pieces. And now we're asking them to sit in school with peers. So the demand on them has increased, and we're wanting them to function at a higher level. If a kiddo hasn't had healthy movement through this brain development, they will drop down, especially when the demand increases, they drop down to what they know and how to process. So somebody who is ADHD, who's moving around, who's touching everything, who gets honed in on, say, if they have a hole in their sock, they're like, oh man, all I can think about is that hole in my sock, right? That kiddo is processing their world in a movement touch, in their movement touch brain. A kiddo who is unable to regulate their emotions, has temper tantrums, flies off the handle. That kiddo generally is dropping totally into their reptilian brain, and just totally unable to process their world because they are just in their primitive brain. This is kiddos who are angry. A lot of times we see developmental delays showing up through here, aggression. Here we see bedwetting. Okay. So when we start to see behavior showing up in a kiddo, it's really a window into the brain and where their brain moves through development. Does that make sense? And all of this is impacted if our brain's not getting healthy input through visual stimulus and movement. And so that's why when we look at this next slide, you look at what's milestone check-ins here. We see at birth, at some point, we want to start seeing that kiddo is holding their head up. Okay, if at 6 months, there's something called what is it? I think it's called the pull test. We're pulling a kiddo up and they have zero head control. That's the first red flag that this kiddo is showing developmental delays. We need to start really doing some understanding where their brain development is and where that stress is within their brain and their structure. Because they're on the trajectory to have some type of developmental diagnosis like autism, ADHD, ADD, something like that. So we can see if kiddo's not moving through these developmental stages, that they're slower in terms of where their brain is, right? But we see rolling over, we see sitting up, crawling, cruising, walking. If we don't see a kiddo moving through this trajectory, it's telling us how their brain's doing in terms of, their development. And yes, we can look at, do they have support and responsiveness from a caregiver? That's vital. But the big one that's missed is if their brain's not getting good, healthy input from how they move, their posture, and their visual input. And so, you can have the physical input impact and create a subluxation as seen through here, but you can also have the chemical stressors or the emotional stressors that can impact how a kiddo carries themselves, that can create some subluxation or lack or poor movement within their spine that impacts how their brain processes. Does that make sense? And so the biggest thing for us here at Monarch Family Chiropractic is recognizing that everybody needs to get checked. And the earlier somebody gets checked, especially in this critical window, is really setting them up to experience a much bigger potential, right, than I think what most people experience, right? We all have this potential when we are born. It's just if we have chemical stresses or physical stresses or emotional stresses that impact us, that all lowers the potential that we can potentially express as we move through life. And so if we can really, within this first 3 years, help support better movement and better input into the brain and create a better process with how the brain fills in the gaps over time, then, we're literally changing our world, because we're changing the health of our kids. So I guess the biggest takeaway, my hope is that you're getting from this is for kids and this is for adults. Behavior is a window into the brain. And so if you find that at a drop of a hat, you're dropping right into anger, emotional dysregulation, you are dropping into your primitive brain. And there are potentially some reflexes that are showing up. There's potentially some subluxation showing up that's impacting how your brain processes. You increase the demand on a brain, and we see where that brain goes, especially if you have past trauma, right? If you are one who, demand goes up and you start moving your body, you start, shaking your knee, start moving, right? That means you need movement and touch to help process your world, because demand goes up and you need to process your world differently, and that movement helps you understand, right? Somebody who gestures a lot, somebody has tics, that starts to tell us, oh, this is how they're processing. We can see it in adults just like we can see it in kids. Some people like to hear themselves talk, and they talk through a lot of things. So you can start to see, oh, they're more auditory in terms of how they are processing the world. So we can start to see how the chiropractic component can fill in the gaps, even for adults. It just takes a lot more work because, you've got a lot more years under your belt as far as, how your circuits and your architecture of your brain has created these pathways and protected themselves. So I know this is a heady topic. I hope I broke it down in a way that was understandable. But if you have questions, please come in with them, and know that if you have kiddos, you are already doing a wonderful, wonderful thing just by being responsive, attuned, and connected. Human touch is one of the most vital things our kiddos need. And I believe that's why chiropractic is so profound, is that you are getting, some physical touch in a very healing way to help take stress off of the brain. We are opening up our 14-day benefit through the rest of February, meaning you can come in and get the exam done at our expense. If x-rays are appropriate, we can do those at a savings. And so if you have kids or you have friends or loved ones who haven't had their spines checked, I urge you, get them in. People who are getting adjusted tend to be more resilient and adaptable to life. And right now, life is pretty stressful. I appreciate that you were here, Dr. Mayakin from Monarch Family Chiropractic. And please bring in your questions to the office. I'd love to answer them.